I've got to get to the rest of the campaign, something extraordinary. How naive are we? I'll tell you something amazing. We actually let non-citizens vote in elections here to choose who runs some of our capital cities, Melbourne and Hobart and Adelaide. Even students from communist China can come and vote in those elections and in some other council elections. And even more extraordinary, as the court has now said, it was more likely than not that Chinese students had actually managed to elect another former Chinese student to the Adelaide Council, this guy, Ling Ji. Now, can you imagine China ever letting an Australian stand in an election for one of its cities and for other Australians to vote them in? Well, have we left ourselves wide open to interference, foreign interference? Now, this Xing Li is Labor linked. He would in fact still be an Adelaide councillor if a court hadn't now ruled that he and his team actually used dishonest ways to get some of those Chinese student votes. Two of his team were secretly photographed in the 2022 council election, collecting voting papers from buildings with lots of Chinese students, either to check that they had voted for Li or to get their voting papers filled in. And the judge ruled that this was illegal, cancelled the results of the election for that ward and tossed Li off the council. 3 years late, mind you. There were even claims by one witness, himself of Chinese background, that Li asked the Chinese consulate in Adelaide for help in getting him elected. Now this Xing Li sure gets about a bit. He is Vice President of the South Australian chapter of the Australian-China Business Council. He was Director of the South Australian Government's China Engagement Strategy. He's worked for the Federal Government's Austrade, and he got a prime seat at a dinner thrown by the Chinese consulate. He's the guy in the red tie. Now, the election fraud is obviously one thing, but the other is that South Australia actually does let foreigners, even international students, vote in council elections if they've lived at their address for just a month. Now, after all this, Liberal MP Frank Pangallo is trying to get State Parliament to change that. But Adelaide is not even alone in this. In Victoria, you can vote for the Melbourne City Council if you're not an Australian citizen, provided you rent or own property in the area. Now, this sure would not have hurt John Sow, who became a popular Lord Mayor. I should stress no one is suggesting that John Sow did anything wrong. As Mayor, John Sow did try to stop fellow councillors meeting the Dalai Lama, the Tibetan leader that China considers an enemy, and also tried to ban the Falun Gong, also fierce critics of Communist China, banned them from the Moomba parade for being too political. And then there's Tasmania. Once again, foreigners can vote in council elections. And not just in the Hobart council elections. This, of course, has raised alarms. In the 2014 Hobart election, more than 300 names were added to the roll of foreign voters in just 3 days. Most were international students from around Sandy Bay. And a Greens Lord Mayor candidate said he was pretty sure some candidates were using foreign students to stack that vote. 4 years later, 2018, the then Tasmanian Greens leader claimed the Chinese Communist Party was trying to influence that council race, with one Chinese Australian candidate holding a leadership position with the Australian Council for the Promotion of Peaceful Reunification of China, which I've explained before is widely regarded as an arm of China's Communist Party to get foreign influence. Now, that candidate denied having any ties to the Communist Party, being influenced in any way, but the Greens leader, who called out this obvious danger of potential election interference by foreign players, maybe with other candidates, who knows, she was called a racist, and by other Greens. And that cheap smear is exactly why so few politicians dare to say anything. That and the power now of the Chinese Australian vote. Well, at least Tasmania's state Liberal government has just circulated a discussion paper asking if non-citizens should really be allowed to vote for who runs our cities and towns. I thought it was pretty obvious, but they're not pushing that argument very hard. They can't afford to offend the Chinese vote. It just asks, should non-citizens enjoy a continuing entitlement to vote at local government elections? Although if this entitlement were to continue, It is proposed a person's ordinary place of residence must have been in Tasmania for the 12 months prior, or otherwise must own property in Tasmania. So they don't want them just to be blowens who've been here for just a month. But surely Australians must be the only people to decide how Australian cities are run. And that should be even more so when we take so many foreign students, particularly from China, which is an aggressive communist dictatorship hostile to Australia. And it's a dictatorship known to threaten Chinese here, including Chinese students, to do what it says or their relatives back in China will suffer. I think it's time Australians stopped being so naive.